Hello and welcome to Restitution, Returning Colonial Loot. I'm Lewis McNaught. The Parthenon marbles need no introduction. More has been written and spoken about these iconic classical sculptures and reliefs than any other contested object in history. But of course, they're not really typical of colonial loot. They certainly weren't acquired under conditions of violence. So why are we talking about them on this podcast today? Well, firstly, because were there to be a resolution of this important dispute, it would have fundamental, significant implications to other contested objects going forward. And secondly, somebody has brought something genuinely new to the debate that can help bring the two sides towards a resolution. That someone is Alexander Herman in a new book entitled The Parthenon Marbles Dispute. Now, there are few people who are more experienced in resolving cultural disputes than Alex, who is director of the UK's Institute of Art and Law. Alex, thanks very much for joining us today. Really appreciate all your time. Look, I want to focus really on those issues that will help move the debate forward. But there have been two big stumbling blocks which you identify in your book. The first one of which is, of course, the lawfulness of acquisition itself. And you make the point that unless we can sort of move beyond that issue, it'll be very difficult to find a resolution. So what kind of evidence did you uncover, perhaps new evidence, to really help us accept the lawfulness of the acquisition of the stones?
Well, as you know, Lewis, for a long time, people had talked about the 1801 letter, which was sometimes erroneously referred to as a firman. And I looked at that document, which had been looked at by many people in the past. And then I looked at subsequent documents that have come to light. So there was an 1802 letter to the voivode from the Ottoman court in Constantinople. That was September 1802, which effectively allowed Elgin's men to continue what they were doing. It showed approval of what they'd been doing up to that point and allowed them to continue. And then lastly, there was an export firman from 1811 that had been signed by the Sultan. It effectively was a firman, that document. And that had been obtained by Elgin's successor as diplomat to Constantinople, Lord Adair. And that very clearly refers to these pieces that had been collected in crates at the port outside of Athens, that had been collected by Lord Elgin, and so on. So it's very clear that they referred to the marbles, and they permitted the final export of what remained at the port of Piraeus at the time. So when I take all of that together and I try to analyze it in a fair and balanced way, I say that on balance, it does appear that the Elgin project did have permission from the Ottoman authorities to do what they did. So I think that position is quite sound, and it would be hard to find any evidence, even in the future, that would in any way disrupt that particular view.
And the other issue is title, ownership, because we know that the ownership title resides with the British Museum. It has done since, I think, 1816 with the British Museum Act. What I didn't realise before I read your book is that title, which I'm not a lawyer, it's a very slippery, and you call it a slippery and evasive concept. What I hadn't realised is that the title extends only up to the shores of the United Kingdom, which kind of begs the question, well, what happens if the marbles were to leave the United Kingdom? Is there some kind of arrangement that Greece and the UK could have about ownership, or how does it threaten the British Museum's willingness perhaps to even allow the marbles to leave the British shores?
Yeah, it's a very good point that you picked up on. I mean, title is a nationally derived ownership right. And in the vast majority of cases, if you acquire title to movable property, or what we would call chattels, in one jurisdiction, it will be recognized in another. If you go on holiday and acquire, a pair of sandals in Spain, and you bring them back to Britain, your title will be recognized. But in some cases, it might not be. And there have been some restitution cases involving Nazi looted art, for example, where title was quite clear in one country, but then was not recognized in another. So that can happen, although those are going to be exceptional cases. So obviously, if the marbles were to leave, either in part or in whole, the UK, there is some question as to whether the title of the British Museum trustees would be recognized by another state. So if they went to Greece, would that title that is vested in the trustees according to the British Museum Act 1963, whether that would be recognized in Greece? There are ways of protecting the title and protecting the the ownership rights of the lender, in that case of the trustees, using immunity from seizure legislation. And immunity from seizure laws are pieces of legislation that have been passed in a number of countries over the past 25 years that protect cultural objects on loan. So not just cultural objects where there's a dispute around ownership, but also situations where maybe the lender might have financial difficulties and creditors are trying to seize a painting that's on display at the Louvre or whatever it might be. There are these laws that protect the work. So whatever the dispute is involving the lender or the borrower, the work itself will be protected, so it can't be seized. So that's probably the best approach if you're trying to preserve, for all intents and purposes, the sanctity of the loan, let's say, and the sanctity of the original title would be the best way of protecting an object that's on loan in a foreign jurisdiction.
Yes, the British Museum must be frightfully nervous that if the objects were to leave the UK shores, there still might be that risk that they'd never get them back. That if they were to loan them to the Acropolis Museum, which is a fabulous museum, and it's dry as well, that the Greeks simply wouldn't return them. In your book, you mentioned the seizure issue, but you also mentioned reciprocal loans as something which could assist and give reassurance to trustees.
Yeah, and I mean, I wasn't the first to develop that idea, because that's been talked about in the current negotiations, and Mitsotakis has mentioned that publicly, and as have others. And I think that's a sensible position, to have those kinds of reciprocal loans. I mean, do the loans that come from Greek museums, do they act as a kind of collateral, so that the British Museum can be assured that if there are any problems with the marbles, they at least have some Greek property? I mean, that's a fairly cynical way of seeing it, but probably there is that view in the back room that might be helpful to have. But I think the benefits probably are the more important aspects to that. The fact that we'd be able to see in the UK some amazing works that have never left Greece before. I personally think that there should probably be more detail about what those works would be, rather than just this sort of vague promise of we'll lend the best works. I think it would be nice to see which ones. And also the thing that's important with that is that it would have to fit in with the British Museum's own plans for the next 5 years or so. As you know, the museum is going to be, or large parts of it are going to be closed for refurbishment. There's a huge project to overhaul the museum in many ways. So it would have to fit with that, and it would have to fit with the exhibition programming. So you can't foist upon a museum works that they aren't expecting or that they don't need for their exhibition programming. There would have to be some very intelligent way of doing that, in terms of proposing specific objects from Greek museums, which are obviously going to be amazing, for display at the British Museum.
Well, Mitsotakis has actually referred to a couple of objects, things like the Agamemnon mask, for example. So they have actually started to give some kind of specific details. Greece itself has actually pulled back a little bit on its demands from the United Kingdom. I think you point out in the book that, for example, instead of returning all of the objects removed from the Acropolis site, not just from the Parthenon, they are restricting now their demands to just the Parthenon itself. Do you envisage Greece making further relaxations for their demands, which might help the process move along?
Well, I think politically, as we know, it's quite difficult for them to do, in terms of the recognition of title of the trustees, the British Museum, in terms of accepting a loan, even if you don't call it a loan, in terms of the duration that it might last. I mean, we've read reports that it might involve some of the pieces going for, say, 10 to 15 years and then returning, and then more pieces going, that sort of thing. So I think that will take a certain amount of flexibility on the Greek side. So they have to be willing to allow for that, which I think is not an easy thing for them. So there will have to be compromise on that side, and there'll have to be some form of compromise on the British Museum side. And the view that they are the only place to display these works in comparison with the other great works of civilization and so on, they're going to have to take a more nuanced approach to that and see museums as something more than just spaces for display. Also, museums have to be areas where they can connect with communities and countries of origin, where there is exchange of research and knowledge and that sort of thing. So there needs to be a new way of envisaging the museum, which is especially important, I think, for the British Museum, especially with everything that they've had going over the last few years.
Yeah, can we go back to the British Museum then? Because there's been a lot of talk about a Parthenon partnership. between, in fact, the chairman of the British Museum and the Greek government. Interestingly, not between the British government and the Greek government. It's been going on for a couple of years. It's gone very quiet recently. What kind of arrangement do you think they are talking about? Also, consider the fact that, given the fact the Duveen Gallery is continually being closed because of rain coming in, water ingress means that those statues will have to be moved. Is that perhaps part of the partnership proposal, that they could actually be loaned to Greece?
Well, I think, yeah, and there'll be larger plans for the museum as well. Large wings will have to be closed and renovated. So I think that the collection as such is not going to be static for the next 5 or 10 years, probably even more. I think George Osborne talked about this as a generational project. So this is something that is going to take a long time. And so it means that parts of the collection are just not going to be in the places that we, as museum going members of the public, expect them to be. And that's I think going to be an opening, a way for a partnership to exist in terms of the Parthenon marbles, maybe some of the other pieces as well. We're not obviously talking about the vast majority of pieces in the collection, but just some of those contentious pieces. There might be opportunities here to start lending, sometimes on a long-term basis, to countries and communities of origin. Something we've seen, I suppose, recently with the Ashanti pieces in the collection, that those have been loaned to Ghana, not Ghana the state, but to the Asante descendants, the traditional rulers there. And that's quite an interesting development, that the British Museum has gotten on board with that, as has the Victoria and Albert Museum. So those will be going to Ghana, I believe, quite soon. And so that sort of arrangement, I think, is probably a sensible one, especially if the British Museum is going to be closed for refurbishment, or large parts of it closed for refurbishment, and so on. So it's about being, I think, open-minded and flexible with collections, and not rigid when it comes to the question of display and where objects have to be kept at all time, because that's a very antiquated view of the museum, in my view.
Absolutely. And I know that UK polls suggest that more and more British people, a majority of British people, now feel that some kind of new arrangement, perhaps either loaning them back or giving them back to Athens, would be appropriate. And I was interested in your book. You referred to various conversations you were having with colleagues and friends in Greece, and suggesting that, in fact, most Greece people would be appreciative of a loan arrangement rather than actually a transfer of ownership.
Well, yeah, I had, in one of the chapters, I built it around a large dinner discussion that I had with some people in Athens. I mean, these are people who are not associated with the political infrastructure or even the cultural infrastructure in Greece. And I put that idea forward, and they seemed quite receptive to it. So I don't know, I haven't done my own polling, Lewis, on that, but maybe we could work on something of that nature. There are some in Greece, and I would say probably the current culture minister, Lina Mendoni, is of this view that they don't want to accept any kind of compromise on things like that, or at least that's the public position. So there's clearly there are voices in Greece that say they would not go that far towards compromise. But I would think that most reasonable, sensible people on both sides would think that that's a proper way forward in this matter.
And moving forward with modern museum thinking, because it does seem that the British Museum is out of sync with modern museum thinking. Restitution used to be described as just the handing back of an object which may have been looted, stolen, or whatever. Now it's part of a new relationship, a new process, which you referred to already. I wonder, should we be leaving this whole debate to the curators to actually have a chance for them to determine what kind of new relationship we should have with the marbles?
Well, I think they're usually the curators and the teams of people who support them. I think they're the ones who understand the objects the best and the context of the objects the best. They understand the relationships between institutions. I mean, many of these people have deep links that go across institutions to different parts of the world, and they're used to loans, questions of import, export, insurance, all the sort of technical issues as well. And I think if you take that as the base, as the foundation, then you'd be able to build a sustainable relationship between the sides, and that can allow for trust. And I think trust is important. You mentioned earlier, Lewis, the question of would the British Museum trust these pieces being in Greece, and would they trust the Greeks to return them at the end of the loan? And I think if they have a good relationship, then they would be able to do that. And obviously no one who's in a strong relationship would ever turn around and do something that would harm the other side. So I think that's an important element of it. And I do agree with that, Lewis, that it is really the museum professionals who are at the heart of this arrangement, whatever it might be. I don't think it should be the politicians on either side, because they don't really have the best interests of the institutions or of the pieces themselves at heart.
How much longer does this grandstanding have to go on with so much goodwill between the peoples of Greece and the United Kingdom to resolve the dispute?
Yeah, it's a good question. The problem is it lends itself to that sort of politicization, because the terms of the debate are quite clear. It allows people on one side to say, well, we stand behind universal museums and we don't want to denude our great national collections. And it allows those on the other side to say, we need to do what's fair. We need to return items to their countries of origin. Look at, the poor Greeks that don't have these pieces in their Acropolis museum. So I think it opens itself to that kind of stark politicization, which is not actually a good way forward, because as we know, I mean, this dispute has been going on for, you could say, over 200 years, from the time of Lord Byron and the original debate in Parliament in 1816. And if it's going to be resolved, it's going to involve quite an integrated solution. It's not going to be a simple one-size-fits-all arrangement. It's going to have to be something that takes into account all sorts of different nuances and sensitivities on both sides. And as a result, it's something that is not going to be a political solution. It's going to have to be, in a sense, a curatorial solution. It needs support from the political agents, but that should come after the original arrangement is met. So probably the best approach on either side is for the politicians to take a step back and to say, let's let the museum sort something out. We will support it, whatever it needs, whether it needs export permits or funding, obviously, is going to be a big part of it. But we'll let the museums come to a sensible solution. We trust our national museums. We trust the people who would be driving that discussion. And whatever they come up with, we'll do our best to support it. That, I think, should be the sensible political position. But unfortunately, it hasn't been on either side.
Well, in your book, you say there's a very real possibility for change. There's certainly going to be some kind of change among the political hierarchy in the United Kingdom. There's also change, of course, at the British Museum, with a new director being appointed. We don't know how Nicholas Cullinan will react yet, but are you confident or optimistic that perhaps this change that you would anticipate will come about as a result of this change in leadership?
It will be interesting to see. Cullinan was at the National Portrait Gallery, of course, beforehand in London, and they're not really known for receiving many restitution claims. So we haven't seen him publicly have to defend one position or the other. But I think a new breath of air, I think, is a good thing in the British Museum. I mean, it's a huge, as you know, Lewis, as a former employee many years back, it's a huge behemoth, and to transform it will take a significant amount of time and willpower. And it's not just the person at the top, although the person at the top is important for that, but throughout the keepers and the curators and the support staff and everyone else. I think they're all good people. The rank and file, as they say, I think are all very, very sensible, good people trying to do the right thing for the collection and establish relationships with countries and communities. I think they're already doing that to a large extent. They're woefully underpaid and I think underappreciated in many respects, and I think that needs to change as well. And the restitution side is one part of it. I think there's a lot of other change that needs to happen as well, but that will affect the position on restitution, which traditionally has been a very, very conservative position, and I think that's going to change with everything else. So I do have hope. I think currently in the political environment, as you alluded to, it's hard to see anything changing overnight. But long term, over the next few years, I think we'll start to see a greater openness on the part of the British Museum. And hopefully that affects their responses to freedom of information requests as well, which they've been known to be a little bit secretive about. And that's not for anyone's benefit.
Well, it seems the ingredients for change are definitely there. But will change happen? Well, that's going to depend on what happens with a new government, perhaps, certainly a new leadership at the British Museum. We'll keep you in touch. Meantime, that's it. We'll see you in the next episode.